right then. So we are live with another episode of the What Lies Beneath Ask Me Anything session. And for those of you who are new to this is a series of AMAs that are hosted on the Test Chat YouTube channel with the idea of exploring a little more uh, in the lives of the legendary testers that we interview. Because what we see normally, when we read their blogs and read their articles, we see things on the surface, but we want to get beneath the surface and understand the philosophy that they bring in, the source of the knowledge that they bring in, because there's so much to learn from. And today I have as my guest Maaret from Finland. Uh, the testing fairy from Finland, if I may call her so. She's written 3 books. She does a lot of work with exploratory testing, a lot with automation testing. She has won the 2 most coveted awards of the testing world, the most admired agile testing person of from the agile testing days, and of course the Eurostar Excellence Award. Both of them she has won, and it gives me a lot of pleasure in welcoming you to the show, Maaret.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much, Maaret. First question, and it may sound a little silly, but I wanted to clarify it on behalf of a lot of people in the testing community. What is the right way to pronounce your last name, Maaret?
I wish I didn't have a last name anymore because it gets so complicated. So Pyhäjärvi is my last name. So
Okay, that's
already the first name is sometimes difficult for people. Kind of like I've been trying to teach people that it's like Ma, like mom, and Rhett, like Rhett Butler in the Gone with the Wind, Maaret. So it's like long beginning, but the last name Pyhäjärvi, it's way too complicated.
Yes, I still would not dare to, pronounce it. But maybe if I go back and listen to the recording a couple of times, practice a few more times, maybe I'll get it.
But I
But
have good
thank you
news
for
for
that.
you. I have good
Yes.
news for you. Maaret is not a very common name in Finland. There are a few of us, but there's not many. So in terms of my kids, I'm internet famous because if you do Google Maaret, you find me generally.
Yes.
You don't need my last name. Just call me Maaret. That's fine.
Okay, that's so kind of you. I'm comfortable calling you Maaret. Well, Maaret, I know that you've been doing a lot of work with exploratory testing and stuff like that. But before getting into things, how did you get started with testing in the first place?
It's been a few years since. After high school, I thought I knew what I want to be, and I thought I want to be a chemical engineer. I was good at chemistry, and I thought I wanted to go to Helsinki University to study chemistry. And obviously, I did apply and I did get there. But at the same time, for some reason, one of my friends wanted to study things around technology, and she needed a ride to the university exams in the technical university. And for me to give a ride, I thought, maybe I'll just, enlist myself to the exams as well. I'll give her a ride. I'll hang around. I'll just, fill in some papers while I'm waiting. And when I filled those papers, I got a second place in a university, another university in Helsinki. So I had 2 places in different universities. The thing that I thought I wanted to do, and the other one, which was mechanical engineering. So I couldn't get to the chemistry side in the technical university because the score was too high, and I wasn't really even, trying properly. And then it turned out that I loved the people in the technical university more. And it turned out that since I'm allergic, I cannot actually ever work in chemistry. That's a death sentence. So I needed to figure out, what do I do? And I spent one summer studying assembly language because I, for some reason, decided that for computer science studies, if you can survive assembly, you can survive anything in programming after that.
Yes.
So I learned assembly one summer. I changed to computer science. And after I had changed to computer science, my previous studies in the Greek language got people recruiting me into a tester position to test Greek Microsoft Office. And I've been doing
Wow.
basically exploratory testing since that first job where they dragged me. And I think my career is pretty much based on the idea that I don't know how to say no. I always say yes to things. And a lot of things happen by accident. And not all accidents are sad accidents, but these are just kind of positive, serendipitous moments.
Yes. Well, that's quite interesting. I've had my love for chemistry in school, but I never pursued it later. I wanted to get into agriculture and stuff, but it never happened. But I find myself in a good spot now. Well, you mentioned about starting exploratory testing back then. So from that time till today, have you seen the outlook towards exploratory testing change?
So definitely we talk about it a lot more in various channels. Uh, Back 25 years ago, there was no ISTQB, there was no kind of like attempt to create a vocabulary of testing yet. So back then, exploratory testing was kind of like a concept that you might run into if you were really lucky and somehow already connected to the international communities, or it just might be the natural way of how you do testing without even knowing exactly what you're doing. But over the years with ISTQB, it has basically split into multiple different things. So different people saying exploratory testing mean a different thing. So if you are kind of like trying to make sense in the world by having these, like labels of things testing that you think that are somehow kind of like, separate and individual, then exploratory testing, it's a weird thing because it's kind of the glue that holds everything together. And what do
Right.
you call that glue? So they've usually tried to make it a technique rather than approach. So
Right.
this kind of
Yeah.
split into technique approach, it's become more permanent and more permeating in the world in those 25 years.
So, what is your take on it? Is it a technique or is it an approach?
I think it is an approach. It's that glue that kind of guides all of the things testing. I was just kind of trying to explain what's the difference between test-driven development and exploratory unit testing.
Uh-huh.
And in test-driven development, you kind of like you have this idea that no matter how good you are or how good you're learning is while you're implementing something, you have a example first, and then you implement against that little example, and then the next example. And if you are really good at learning and coming up with those examples, and they're really representative, you're kind of doing exploratory testing because you're,
Yes.
continuously coming up with more and more of those cases. But what I
Yes.
see with a lot of developers is that they actually take whatever they were given, kind of in some narrow way, as the examples that they implement against, and they miss that exploratory testing part, kind of like they miss that
Right.
glue around. So there's very easy to find things where you can just kind of point out that you never implemented anything against this, and what about this kind of a thing, and what if I combine these kind of things. And it's kind of funny in the sense that you can explore on the unit testing level, and there's this research basically saying that you can find 77% of your production bugs, you could reproduce them after you find them, you could reproduce them with a unit test, which then also means that if you were really good at exploratory unit testing, you could find 77% of those production bugs. So I think that's fascinating, and that's one of the things that I've had many conversations recently.
No, I quite like this thought. In fact, it draws me to an article or to a page that I read recently from James Lindsay talking about using automation with relation to exploratory testing. And I saw a tweet from you as well the other day on that subject. So, what is your take on that? Because generally, I have seen people say, "Oh, you know what? Exploratory testing, you can't do much with automation." Okay, so what is your take on that one?
So if you think about automation that fails today in your own environment, it fails, and you get that red and you know that you need to figure out what's wrong. That's actually start of exploratory testing. You start exploring based on that automation in order to figure out why is it failing, whether it's failing for, uh, multiple different kinds of real reasons or something completely different than what you were not even expecting to get. So there is this connection that you have kind of like the spider web of automation that always calls you in to explore. And you will want that, especially when there's, fast going changes and way too many things to look at. You want to be the spider who builds that web. But that web isn't perfect. So you still also want to look at which part of the web you're reconstructing, and you want to explore without automation, maybe, or explore to create more automation. So I usually frame it so that I think of it as kind of like automation is it's a way for me to document some of my testing.
Right.
I
Yes.
document only a small percentage of the testing that I do in that automation. It's not like 100% of my tests end up automated. I might be doing kind of like, especially on the unit level, I might try like hundreds of values and I leave behind maybe 10 values. But I know that the 10 are the right ones because I was trying different kind of values and seeing how it responds. And I know that then these, they are kind of, they belong into the same equivalence class. I just don't have the theory, but I have actually tested that. So in a way, I
Right.
frame it so that I think that you could also say that while preparing to do that little bit of automation testing, everything manual gets done on the way. And that's
Yes.
exploratory testing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can totally relate to that. In fact, I stumbled upon James's article and his thoughts on that, and I was like, yeah, this is pretty much how I like to think about automation. Now, what he also says very effectively is how you can augment your, exploratory testing with things that you can do with automation, which is not just limited to your tests, but talking about data, talking about environment, you know, giving you that flexibility to do more with exploratory testing.
Yeah,
And that's the kind of mindset that I have always had. So what is your thought on that one? I mean, augmenting
definitely.
your testing with automation.
Definitely. You should be augmenting. One of the things I did, well, a couple of months ago already now, I had a new feature where there's basically every 15, 20 seconds, there might be new data coming in. Like it's a stream of data
Right.
that changes continuously. And it would be silly of me to, sit here and stare at my screen and see if the data is changing as I expected. Especially when I want to see a week of data. Like, am I going to sit in front of my computer and watch it change 24/7 for a week? Like, that's just a silly, silly idea. Instead, what
Right.
I could do is I could either control the data, so like I can take
Yes.
the control of the data, and I can kind of push whatever data I want so that whenever I go and sample, I get exactly what I like. I have a rule of what do I get at this hour. I can compare those time frames, so I can do that. Or what I did in this case is I created a script that I left just running in the background continuously. And
Right.
it just pinged me if there was something that was out of the pattern that I was expecting. So if I needed to attend, it was again that spider web that kind of said, "Bing, bing, come here. You need to pay attention." So I
Right.
could do other things. I think there's so much potential. It's more about the creativity, like the ideas that we have on how and what we want to test and why that drives it, rather than this idea of manual versus automated. I wish we didn't talk about manual and automated testing anymore.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. So for the audience, guys, if you have any questions, I know a lot of you are connected already. Hello to everyone who's joined. Please shoot across your questions. I will not wait till the end to take your questions. I will accommodate your questions as we go along. So having spoken about a little bit about automation, I also know for a fact that you are a polyglot. That means that you know more than five languages.
I think
And
I'm at
in
16.
16, oh wow. Six, you can actually program in 16 different languages?
No, I can Google how to do things in 16. 16 is what I have programmed something in.
Oh
So
wow,
again,
that's
when you go to a technical university, you have to do all kinds of weird exercises. Like that's where I had
yes.
to do some stuff in Fortran. So you figure out the basics of it. There are polyglots who are kind of like, they can write anything out of their memory. I cannot. But given the need of doing things, I've done it in enough languages that I know how to figure multiple different languages out.
Wow, 16 is like I can't even imagine 16. Let me try to count how many I can. Uh maybe six. Yeah.
Yeah,
Six at the
six,
most.
six, six would qualify as a polyglot, by the way.
Oh,
So again,
good
uh,
to know. Yeah.
one of the things I try to remind people who are thinking about they are not programmers is that
Yeah.
you're actually a programmer after you've written your first lines in that programming language.
Yes.
There is no
Yes.
level of how much you have had to do before you can call yourself programmer. It might be that not everyone will pay you for the work you do in programming. And again, like my work isn't really programming. I do some as part of my work, but there's a queue of people in my office who want to write programs, but there's very few who can see what correct and incorrect is. So it turns out that it's usually better if I am not at least alone on that programming task, but we share it amongst the team. And again, the whole exploratory idea, you shouldn't be separating it so that I have the idea and you have the implementation. You should do
Correct.
something to kind of, share the idea. You can't separate the design and the execution of the test. You can't separate the manual and the automation of the test without losing the learning and the agency that is required on really good thinking around testing. So it's the exact same thing with anything related to programming. So it's a big thing.
Absolutely. 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 Sorry, you were saying something. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, just that it's a big thing. It's not just this single one thing that we call programming.
Right. I think what you said, should give a confidence to a lot of testers who are confused right now, thinking about programming, thinking about getting into automation. There is some sort of hesitation in trying to do so. The questions usually that come up are, how many languages or what kind of language do I need to learn? Do I need to watch the popular trends? How do I take my first steps towards my journey in automation? So, what would be your message to the newbies who are starting their journey with automation?
Pick the language of your team. Start there. So again, you don't have to be able to do everything your team does or everything that is done in your team. Just like reading English or reading Finnish, whichever language you want to learn on the natural languages world, it usually starts with learning to read things. Then you write simple things. And it takes a
Yeah,
while before, if ever, actually, not everyone needs to be professional writer and write for money, even in the natural languages. Uh, you can just do some programming that is useful for that couple of hours, and things like just kind of like monitoring something on a web user interface so that you don't have to have your eyes on the UI all the time. That's kind of simple stuff to learn to do first, and it doesn't mean you know everything, but you already know something that is useful for you. So start somewhere.
absolutely. Start somewhere. Yes, absolutely. That's a very important message for the newbies to get started, and not just for the newbies, for the experienced people as well who sometimes have this roadblock. I've got stuck and I don't know where to go. So, find your way, start somewhere, and then you should be able to do. So, here is a question that has come in from the audience, and it is Guillermo, if I can pronounce the name correctly. Question: how can we accomplish to include exploratory testing as a normal part of the testing process?
I don't know what a normal part of the testing process is because I start with kind of like exploratory first. I don't really think of it as somehow different. So if we think kind of through the how I usually test in some of the features that I work in my team is that we have this what we call a discovery phase usually, where we haven't yet
Mhm.
implemented anything. We are kind of in the phase where we're focused on understanding what the business and the customers want and what's the problem we're solving. We're kind of clarifying the problem. And in that stage, I usually get to explore a lot on kind of like, looking at any pictures we have on like, if we put the button here, do I see anything that might be kind of like out of the ordinary? I get to listen to my team clarifying things, and I can point out that no one is talking about that. And it means that it won't be implemented. Is that something we wanted or not? So there's already a lot of exploration going on in that space, and then writing some of that down in a format where we can remember it a little later as well is part of it. Then after the discovery, kind of like having the clarity in the team, including the testing perspective clarity and the development perspective clarity, uh, we usually move into implementation, and implementation happens pull request by pull request. So every single day I can expect that there's 1 or 2 pull requests coming in, and they get merged, and I can look at whatever changed. And it is up to me to kind of decide if I wait for, some of them to collectively build something bigger, or if I look at them each individually. And in my team, since developers actually look at each individual pull request already, it doesn't always make sense for me to kind of jump into every single one of them. But I can see that certain ones of them kind of like, they put together the feature in a sense where I can provide some extra value. And then I would just test that. In the end of having done things, kind of like I've done something today, maybe something in a week, I write down some notes of what did I do. I've never created a test case. And most of the things that I write down, they are either kind of like title level test cases saying there's a new feature, remember to find this feature again if you need to remember in 6 months. So I write test cases as an output, like even the so-called manual test cases, or I write test cases as an input. And then I kind of like test them again in the end of the test cycle.
Maaret, your mic seems to be.
I think this was saying something's wrong with my mic. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes, can hear you.
Nope.
Okay, can hear you. Yes. Cannot. No. No. Cannot hear you. It says. No, cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now.
Yes.
Okay. I needed to disconnect the mic and put it back on.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were
So,
saying you're talking about. Yeah.
so how far did you hear? You heard the part probably where I was talking about writing down manual test cases as output,
Yes.
and then
Yes.
I was just kind of adding after that also automation is an output. So I might start building it from day one, but by the
Mhm.
end of the time of having tested that feature, usually the automation is also around.
Okay. Okay. So I think if I may just give a little more context to Guillermo's question, I will try to do it. Guillermo, if you think I didn't get it, please feel free to correct me. So generally, what happens is, and this is based on the ISTQB ways of doing things. Generally, people go out and write a bunch of test cases, with detailed steps, and they try to follow it, try to make sure that they have tried to cover all the written requirements. I mean, for the ones that are not written, I mean, nobody bothers, but at least you try and map them. So they do a requirements traceability matrix and try to map everything, then write and then follow those instructions. And then maybe towards the end of the test cycle, squeeze in a little bit of time to say to the team, you know what, now go and explore. Okay, you've tested whatever was there in the requirements because we had written test cases. Now go and explore. So that is
Yeah.
the general tendency. And that's why probably the question that Guillermo is asking is how do you include it as a normal part of the testing process? So
Yeah,
the normal
which is
testing process would be like first write test cases, then try and
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is that doesn't have to be normal. That's exactly what I'm
yeah,
trying to say. It doesn't have to be normal. I think
right.
it's a waste of time to write the test cases in advance, trying to analyze in detail. I much prefer kind of printing out on paper, for example, or just kind of like, creating a folder of all the requirements and just color coding, like I've explored these requirements. I've confirmed these. And I I have definitely written test cases before, but it tends to create worse testing. And yeah, sure, you can, like I've been to a lot of projects where they ask you to do this, and then there's this surprise Friday afternoons where you time box some exploratory testing. Maybe you even bring the entire team together to do some exploratory testing. And then you're wondering, why are we now finding all the trouble, all the problems, all the bugs we're finding in this session, when we spent the entire week not actually finding any of that? And I think this is an organizational anomaly. So I often talk about this idea that there's exploratory testing, the verb, like all testing is exploratory in a sense. And then there's exploratory testing, the noun, whatever your managers organization-wise are asking out of your testing process. And some of the managers are really good at making testing bad. And I think that's one of the things that I wish wasn't this way. And I've been looking for the words to explain to the managers that you're actually not helping. You are making it worse. And this whole appearance of kind of like, just give a script and it can't take you so long to run through that script and just do that script. And why are we still seeing problems? It is everywhere, that conversation. And the only way I can break out of that conversation is that I don't play that game. And with 25 years of having done this, when I go and say, we will not write the test cases, the managers say, yes, boss. Nowadays, they didn't say this 10, 15 years ago. Right. So maybe, what I would advise people to do is do something to build up that kind of storytelling and metrics-oriented approach of showing that this is not the way it should be, or not the only way it could be done. And if you're still forced to do that, like James Lindsay, again, has a really great older material where he talks about I think it's like 20 ways of managing exploratory testing is the presentation that he has online. It's awesome. But one of the things he talks about is that one of the ways we do it is stealth. So you kind of you lie to your managers and you do the right things in some corner in the dark room, and you never explain to them how the results come. But you give an appearance that all of the scripts are producing all these great results. And I think it's sad we have to do that, or we have had to do that. And I wish we didn't, but it might be that we do.
Well, you know what? Referring back to that presentation from James. Yeah, I mean, it is true that in certain organizations we have had to do that. I have had to do that myself in the past, the stealth way of doing things. But then later on, I realized it's better that we show something and back our results with the data, with the information that we've collected so far, and say, you know what, we tried this new experiment, and this is what we got out of it. Now, this is what is actually going to show some value to the management, and then they are going to find it difficult to say no to our approach. But if you were to go back and do that, but it's very difficult. Thank you for pointing me to that article. I'll in the description of this video I will add the link to both James's article and the presentation. I think I know where it is. I'll find it and I'll put it. Thank you for referring to that. Now, there is another follow-up which comes in from Tarak Shankar. He's asking, maybe in some parts of the world, in certain geographies, the normal part, as in testing the test script first and executing them manually, while in exploratory testing, we learn from the previously applied steps and perform new steps to figure out more stuff and risks. Do you agree with that kind of an approach, or
So very few people will follow a test script exactly as it's given. So it might say, but we talked about this just before we started this call, that it might say that you need to reboot. Mm-hmm. And what you actually have to do is a hard reset, physical reboot, and not just a virtual kind of operating system level reboot. And there's these kind of little things where it's either you didn't actually understand what was said, or you do it how you interpret it, that already introduce variation into the scripts, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And what I'd like to see is that the variation we introduce is such that it makes it more likely for us, with the little time we invest in testing, to provide good results.
Yes.
like I did a talk earlier this week where I was trying to say that maybe, like I called it, let's do a thing and call it fool. Because I'm so tired of explaining what's exploratory testing and what's not, and all of that. Kind of like, I just want us to do a good job. So I was talking about
Yeah.
this idea that we have a results gap. Like
Yes.
there's this level of testing results and reacting to them that we would be happy with, especially as a product organization. That means usually that developers don't have to come in the middle of the night. The product owner can rely on asking for new features rather than continuous stream of fixes and fixes.
Yeah.
You know what good feels like, good quality
Yes.
feels like in a team, if you've ever been in places where you've had both of the the good and the not good. So you have this aspirational level, and then you have the team like I have right now. Like my developers are brilliant, like they are super good at testing. And if I give them half an idea of testing, half an hour later they come with the test script, like the automation, like it's now in the automation, you can never test it again. Ha ha ha. Like it's like a little bit like a funny, positive competitive thing. But it's
Yes.
also like they're very actively picking up hints from me on what they could add to whatever they're testing. And still there's this gap, like there's this weird results gap that I look at the application. Like last week I looked one, and I report that, okay, we had lost our test environment in the last 6 months. They didn't realize that. I report 7 functional bugs, and then they're like, oh, those are interesting. Like, I think they're interesting too. Like, all of them are surprises. I could never have expected that you code these kind of bugs. And yes, the automation didn't catch them, but
Yeah.
I did catch them when I looked at it, and we had really great conversations and improved things based on those conversations. So that's usually the good team results gap that I love working in. But then there's also this kind of like a secondary results gap. Like I was working with another team earlier in the same organization that I'm in right now. And there, the managers were thinking about testing in terms of kind of like testers take care of system testing and developers just do unit testing. That was the manager guidance. And the way that testing happened is, well, just again today I saw that they are in production with a really bad bug, and it's every single week the same team that I have already left is showing that they have the results gap and it is in action. I still keep pinging them on like, maybe you would be ready to talk to me and actually learn to do this now. But no, not yet, not yet. But they have this, like I call it like a pizza box pointing out type of testing. So there's this lower bar of what the quality out of developers is, where it feels like, they ate a pizza, they threw the trash right where they were, in the middle of the living room floor. And then they have defined, the managers usually have defined that developers need to be so busy and not test because we have this tester person who is supposed to take care of it. That
Yes.
your job as a tester is to, point out pizza box, pick it up. Pizza box, pick it up. And that's not work for a person. Like I really, at this point of my career, that's not the work that I want to do. And I also have
Correct.
teams that have that kind of a results gap. And you can imagine that if you have the pizza box style of gap, it is really difficult to get to the excellence and surprises ever. So it is really an organizational challenge to start explaining how do we organize in a best possible way so that we together can deliver what we were supposed to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that. You've spoken about, without actually using the word, you've spoken about collaboration here. How well you work with the developers and how well the developers respond. Now, another spot or another thing that you've been speaking about a lot, and you've in fact written a book on it, is ensemble programming. Um, I know that has got a strong connection with testing as well. Why you just call it programming? So, would you like to brief the audience on what it is and how it fosters the culture of collaboration within the team?
Yep. So people usually know about pair programming first or pair
Yes.
testing.
Yes.
And the difference between pair programming and pair testing is that in one of them, the activity is programming, which involves testing as well, and in another one, it's testing, which involves programming as well. We just prefer to
Correct.
label them with differently.
Yeah.
And there's two styles of kind of pairing. There's this what we call traditional pairing, where one is on the keyboard and the other one is reviewing what is going on in the keyboard. So whoever is on the keyboard is kind of speaking out loud about their thinking processes so that you can review it. That's traditional. And then there's this other way, which is called strong style, where the idea is that they instead of reviewing as the person off keyboard, you're using your words to tell what needs to happen. Kind of you start from the higher level of intent, like I'd like you to reboot the server. And if you see no movement on the keyboard for the other person, maybe they don't know how to reboot the server. And then you tell kind of like, okay, so run Docker compose down, and then Docker compose up does D. Like that's how you reboot the server in this case.
Yeah.
So kind of like the control in strong start pairing is off the keyboard in the person who is supposedly reviewing it, but actually the reviewing happens on the keyboard. The ideas and the responsibility is off the keyboard. This is something that I learned like only some years ago, that some of the pairing that I had done in collaborative situation was basically me watching someone who was bad at explaining and I was bad at asking. And it was awful. I hated pairing. I absolutely despised pairing. And then I learned about strong style pairing, and I learned kind of like how to create that better connection, how you can take a complete newbie and give them the keyboard, and then they can control the pace in how you go so that they're always on par with the pair, and how you can take a developer and tester and you can switch over kind of who's on the keyboard, and you can create that much stronger connection. So that then kind of the strong style pairing, that takes you to ensemble
Yeah.
programming and ensemble testing. So instead of having one person off keyboard, what if you had a group of people, like the entire
Correct.
team? And then what you do is basically you rotate who's on the keyboard for a few minutes, who is the main kind of navigator, who's the person who is using their words in order to say what's going on. And you have this like hive mind, like you're working on the same thing so that when I say something, you are supposed to continue where I left off when we rotate. That's the
Yeah.
ensemble way of working. And
Yes.
it is a surprising way of learning things you didn't know you didn't know. Because when you see, like you say, reboot it, and you see somebody doing a reboot in a way that you didn't expect, for example,
Right.
you can say, no, 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 not that way. What are you doing? Or that's curious. I didn't know you can reboot that way. Can you do it that way? And we can see if it's the same or different. So it actually
Yeah.
increases that serendipity that you need in order to do good exploratory testing and discover things that you didn't know of.
Well, I like how you've connected the dots, and you've connected the whole idea of ensemble with exploratory testing. I love this explanation. This is one of the finest explanations on ensemble testing that I have ever heard of. Well, I move on to the next question, and this is from Faiz, and he's asking, nowadays we see an imbalance in the teams, job descriptions, and in people when it comes to test craftsmanship and test automation skills. What is the right balance of those skills as per you, and how do you achieve it?
So this is a difficult one in the sense that I don't see any particular reason why you couldn't know how to test and how to program in the same person. There's no reason to say that these two are separate. But the practice, what I see is that I have, I'm going to say it out loud, even though it sounds bad. I have the junior programmers who can barely program test related things, who don't know how to do testing, but can barely do the programming in the testing space. And they come in with the test automation as in kind of like, this is what I'm supposed to do. They usually minimize the world so that it appears that everything they know of gets done by them, but the results gap is very imminent and everywhere. And I don't know how to solve that, but I would like to believe, well, I have believed in my day to day life that when I encounter a test automation engineer that doesn't know how to test, I can teach them to test. When I encounter a test craftsmanship person who doesn't know how to program, I can teach them to program. And it is a one day at a time up until whenever you are, so old that you no longer want to work for money for other people. So there's still time on doing that. But it is a real problem because projects are not ready to recruit 2 people. They
Yeah.
want that one. So what I think is happening is that if you have the mix of those 2 skills, like if you have the what I now call contemporary exploratory testing,
Mhm.
many people will hire you in a heartbeat. That is a most wanted skill set, and it is not very common. So finding a way of learning that balance and noticing if you have that results gap or if you have the skill to actually remove it from your team, not just provide automation services for them, but remove that results gap while still writing automation. That's the most wanted type of testers, both skills.
Absolutely. I've been having this conversation for a long time with a lot of people, and you know, people keep telling me, you know what, I interviewed 100 testers today, and none of them, everybody wants to do automation, but they can't test.
Yes.
so, so that I would think that we need to look at the job descriptions a little more, because the way the job descriptions are written these days, at least in certain geographies, it is filled with a number of tools. And talking about tools, there is a question from Nikhil where he's saying that people are even saying that there are tools available in the market for doing exploratory testing. So, some would go ahead and list that in the job description. What is your take on this whole tools thing? People are running behind tools. What is your take on that?
I think tools are really useful in many things and many ways in this whole software industry. Like IDEs have evolved a
Yeah.
lot. They do a lot of the work that we had to do before, and even if I don't like the stealing notion that GitHub Copilot, the computer assisted code authoring tool, even if I don't like the reuse without by stripping licenses, I don't like that concept. Uh, it's like Google at your fingertips in an IDE. I do like that concept. So if we could solve some of the let's not steal and let's work kind of in an honest and open way, then that would be just great. I believe those tools will do wonders in the programming space as well. But it still requires a person to control it. It's the same
Yes.
thing with kind of like you can have scripts that do some parts of your exploratory testing. Like you could have something that kind of clicks every button and just reports any big visible error messages. Like maybe you could define like a regular expression of rules of what kind of things you want to be alerted on. It saves you a lot of time, but you still probably have to go and analyze whether those are right or wrong kind of things that it's telling you. And in the space of tooling for exploratory testing, I would actually love a way of kind of me to write free form notes and then somehow have some kind of a program or some kind of tool figure out what have I tested and what have I missed. Like
Yeah.
comparing, for example, my past styles of doing similar things with similar changes, and maybe suggest to me ideas that I haven't considered in that moment. So I'm definitely looking for these tools, but I think recruiting based on can you operate Cucumber, it's usually not the most important thing. But then again, like we started with the polyglot idea, like if you know
Yeah.
one language, you can learn a second one. If you know one tool, you can learn a second one. So in a lot of cases, what I look for when I ask for particular tools, what I'm saying is, if you haven't taken the time and energy by now to learn any of these tools, I'm not going to be the place where you get to try your first one. So it's
Absolutely.
not so much of the specific tool.
Absolutely. And I personally believe that when we talk about tools, most of the tools tend to provide a free trial for 2 weeks or something like that. So there is no harm done in going out there and trying it out before you say, oh, you know what, this is good, this is bad, and then you get into the semantics of, oh, this programming language and that programming language. At least give it a try, is what I would say. And coming to the context of exploratory testing, I think you're absolutely right in saying that they may be able to assist you with certain aspects of it, certain steps, maybe some of the things, like this button, trigger a remote reboot or something like that. Okay, where normally what we did back in our project was to write 5 lines of Perl code. So the tool will eliminate the need for those 5 lines of that Perl code, where it would just go and trigger it, and you would do a reboot remotely. So something like that. Now, sorry, you were saying something.
I was saying that I went to this one launch of a product, like it was a test management tool. Like we have tons of them. Like I don't have any preference on any of them, and I would prefer generally not to use them. But this particular one, it was done by this startup company, which is led by a Black woman. So I wanted to kind of show my support and go and see what they built. And it was really fascinating because what they had built is it's like a manual test case generation with AI, where you get kind of like you write in use cases, or well, the stories, and it gives you the test cases that you need to kind of like stepwise mark done. And I'm like, if I had to fake that I care about that stuff, if my customers thought that it means really that I have some of that stuff, I would love to use a tool to generate that. I know it's complete crap. Like I would never actually think it's doing the work for me. But for the appearance of work, if I have to make that appearance, why wouldn't I use a tool for that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think we have had some very nice questions from the people in the audience. Please come with more questions. So now we've spoken about tools a little bit, and I want to continue talking about tools. The market is now getting filled with these low code, no code tools. And I want to hear your perspective. You're already smiling there. So yeah. So what are your thoughts on these tools?
Do I need to say more? No, I think it's funny how people think that the current test automation tools, which are high code supposedly, that they're actually high code, because they're not that high code already. And the whole kind of like trouble with understanding what you've built and debugging and being able to figure out what is it that you're looking at, and kind of like it works as a magnifying glass of looking at certain details. So you find some problems while you're building that automation script, instead of, you don't find the problem when you run the automation, you find it when you build the automation. I have had so many good positive things on the no low code side. So for me, it's really difficult to see, why do I want that low code? Like it feels like it's making me do stuff on the testing levels that I just don't care for. And it might be that I'm just not the audience. I'm not the right person. Like I'm working in R&D, and I get to do a lot of very deep and very insightful multi-million user exploratory testing type of activities. Maybe I'm not the audience for that. Maybe there is kind of like, those pizza box places where that would be more useful than in wherever I go. But I always consider this possibility of removing or changing the organization so that the pizza box way of working is no longer the thing. And if you look at a developer on their own language doing tests, it is magical how quick it is. And adding a low code solution, which is basically a new programming language then for the developers, I haven't yet bought into the idea that that would be useful. So I don't like the idea of separating testing from the developers in the first place into the testers, so the pizza box level of that gap. So I feel like the low code is just moving us kind of further away into two teams, and it might be, it might be necessary, or it might even be natural for some places. Like if you do IT testing, which I don't do, like projects, you do Salesforce configurations, and that's your application development. it's an entirely different world, and it's not like I'm not trying to solve everything in testing in the world. I'm trying to usually solve whatever I have in my project right now, and I also pick my projects so that I find them interesting. So it might just be that I haven't been in a team where that would be useful.
Well, in my experience, so I have been trying my hands on a lot of these low-code tools, trying to see what they can offer. And so far, I've touched upon 60 plus tools. And what I have seen, based on all the experimentation that I have done, is most of them are context specific. They are, operating in a certain context. Now, when you take them outside that context, they fail. They don't serve the purpose anymore. So it is always, in such situations, there's always a need for us to augment these tools with some, high code tool, as they might want to call it. So you might need a Cypress or a WebDriver IO to cover up for some of these tools. And so in certain contexts, me being a consultant, customers do ask me, how do we solve this problem? In certain contexts, I have myself offered, the customers to look at some of the low code solutions, just so that they are able to bridge the gap that is there. And the gap, and by that gap I mean, is the knowledge gap that they have, where they do not have the required testers with that knowledge of that certain programming language or something. Where, just to give you an example, in one of my previous projects, there was a specific need for a Selenium C sharp combination, and that combination was just not available. So we thought of bringing in a low code tool which would augment, or which would sort of solve this problem for a while we focused on training our people. Like you said, that we can pass on the knowledge, we can train them on Selenium, we can train them on C sharp and bring them up to speed. So within the next 6 months, while we had to keep up with the company's deadlines and goals and everything else, we let this tool sit in there and do some of the testing while we were preparing our folks. So that kind of a solution. So you know, like I was saying, I mean, it feels could fill in certain contexts, but not every context. It's an interesting world out there with these tools. But I liked your reaction first when I when I mentioned the low code tools.
So again, like it's more, and I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that you have looked at 60 of them. There's an
Yeah.
overwhelming number of them, and it
Yes.
is really not easy for anyone in the user space, kind of like organizations, to figure out which one of them is worthwhile to try. And how
Correct.
far are you have you're going to have to try it? Like, are you going to just pick one where you like the salesperson or the technical contact that you first meet, or like any of these could be useful in that sense. But there's so many options in that space, and you can very easily get stuck in this kind of like cycle of evaluating and evaluating, like always looking for the next one. And one of the reasons why I now volunteered with the Selenium PLC, the project leadership committee, I started there like 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, is that Selenium has been around for like 10 years.
Yes.
It's not that I like Selenium. I don't actually. I'm a playwright girl. I'm definitely a playwright girl. But I admire the fact that Selenium has stuck around for quite some time.
Yes.
It's built a relevant size user base. It's an easy thing for people to choose because there's enough of community to help you through
Yeah.
all kinds of hurdles. And if it survived this long, it's probably going to survive the next 10 years as well. And I don't want to spend all of my testing time in selecting the next shiny tool. I'm happy with the 80% shine and not having to always go and find the next great tool. So I really want to slow some of the aspects of my life down. And that's one of the reasons that kind of drives me to, look at these communities that have been around for longer and see what we could do to make them stick around even longer and build that sustainability that the communities really need in order to rely on these tools.
Well, so talking about these tools a little more, you mentioned about people getting stuck in the evaluation cycle for a long time. So let's say we are starting with a new project and we want to look at some of the tools. So what would be some of your suggestions or ideas around how to select the right tool? What would be the basis?
So I start with the fact that I think every single one person in the team, including all the developers, need to use the tool. I've been, recently I've been a little notorious on removing robot framework from various organizations in Finland. It doesn't make me popular, but I have actually managed already 5 organizations giving up on selling on robot framework and moving to PyTest. So the reason usually is that when the developers get to work on the language they already work on, be it Python or Java or whatever there is, they can help help the testers who were contributing to the automation, kind of like as a service next to the developers. They can help them level up much faster. So it might be inconvenient for a while, kind of like you're told things that you don't even understand what they mean, but they're giving you examples of, hey, this is how you could do it, and this is maybe a better way of doing it for maintainable style. But you get these teams where every single person in the team is contributing to the test automation. And that's what that's how I define success in project nowadays. It's not that there's a single person who runs that automation and the automation is doing some testing for us. But when that one person leaves after 10 years, which is what happened 6 months ago in Vaisala, where I work right now, if the team continues with whatever that 10 years was doing with the automation, then it's probably good. And this wasn't the case. So very often we have this kind of like, 1 or 2 people, small teams that provide a service. And as soon as they're out of the building, none of that continues. And low code, since there's so many different tools, it is next to impossible to recruit the next person who knows exactly the tool that the previous
Exactly.
person used. And not everyone is keen on learning, 60 tools. I think that's, impressive.
No, I was actually curious about these tools, and that's how I started looking
Yeah.
at them one after the other. And like I said, I mean, almost every tool is providing that trial period for us to try. So I'm like, okay, why not? And then I soon saw, Federico Toledo, the the CEO from Abstracta. He also mentioned that he's also trying out. So I was like, okay, maybe we should be able to exchange notes someday. And we've spoken in between a few times about these tools and what he's been finding out, what I've been finding out.
I've been doing a few of these tools as an ensemble thing, kind of like when they want to
Oh,
do a demo for me, I said, I'm willing to meet, but I want us to implement something together with your tool. So I know what I want to implement. I come with the problem, and they come with the person who does that. And it's a really nice way of learning and figuring things out. And unfortunately, it has sometimes been that, oh, you can't do that easily. That's not something that you can do. So kind of like starting from your own use cases. Again, I probably have a little bit of clout that I've collected over the years that I can go and say, like, I'm not giving you my time unless you're giving it the way that I want. But it is still it's a nice way of kind of like bridging that gap of, we show you the best bits when
yeah,
you're working on something that is controlled by you.
yeah. Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting conversation. So talking about collaborating, talking about creating a space where developers and testers can work together for the tools. Also, you mentioned that it is very important that the developers and testers both should be able to use it. So quite obviously, if I understand that correctly, any automation strategy or test automation strategy, if it is ever thought of or written in the organization, it should map with the product development strategies, what I would think. It should be aligned. So what is your thought on the test automation strategies that people talk about?
I feel like you've read some of my blog posts. I never write a strategy. I don't write strategies. I go on a
Okay,
whiteboard.
I must admit, I have read many of your blog posts, not just
Yeah.
one or two.
So I feel like we have a general bias in this industry of thinking that when we write down a strategy, it's somehow doing some of the heavy lifting for us, and it almost never is. What is doing the heavy lifting instead is building these networks of people and these trustful relationships, and making sure that we have current ideas somehow shared, so that if I tell the story of how awesome we are at automation, your story, it's not exactly the same because it's your story, but it matches from the relevant aspects. And the best way to get to that kind of like matching stories amongst different people in the organization is not by giving them a document they can read and then hoping they repeat it right, but it's actually to talking about the relevant bits and pieces of that. And I've been kind of collecting the ideas that drive my automation things. Like I very heavily believe that having one test case in a week is better than having a strategy of what we'll have in 6 months. Because if you have one test case automated in a week, you can have that running for the next 6 months, and you can kind of like continuously be thinking in exploratory testing terms. Did it ever do any useful work for me? Could I have actually taken the risk and never running that test case? So you can kind of like go into this continuous learning. So I look for something changing, something growing, incremental improvements, rather than trying to describe the ideal world. There's so many uncertainties, and analysis is not what gets us away from those uncertainties. Implementation is. So we discover the work that needs to be done when we are doing the work.
Well, so that brings me to a question. Most of the organizations of late have been stressing on the need for more and more automation and having a strategy in place. And so how do you go and convince these stakeholders, the CXOs of the organization, that rather than focusing on strategy, focus on getting that bit done? There is too much focus on strategy and very little focus on getting the things done.
So I allow my manager, or actually my director, I allow him to introduce me as a test automation specialist. I think that's ridiculous because I am not, at least I don't want to be that by my professional identity. Like he's always introducing me. Like Maaret is our principal test automation engineer. Like seriously, I'm not. I'm actually principal test engineer. Automation is nowhere in my title. But I do believe that every single one of the testers and the developers we recruit is going to be working on test-related automation as well. So I don't think it needs to be kind of emphasized in that way. But I get that he wants to emphasize it. So the strategic thinking, I usually try to understand what is the thing that they're concerned of, and usually they're concerned of progress. So kind of like how is this growing? Where are we taking it? Do we need more people? So I have those conversations about the need of people, the right kind of people, and that sort of things. But I don't necessarily really write that into a strategy. So there's more of strategic thinking and learning, and less of writing a strategy. So more of the action. Again, the exploratory, more of the performance rather than the artifact.
Absolutely. So here is an interesting question that is coming in. Is there something like a test case repository, and it is followed up with a little bit of an explanation? I can see you smiling already, because we are facing a lot of problems like maintaining test cases, updating, add affected areas. They should be easy to grab, enhance with business logic changes and all these kind of things. I mean, so these are some of the tendencies that we see in a lot of organizations where testers are used or are sort of asked to focus heavily on test cases and on test case repositories and things like that. So what's your take on that?
Uh, uh, I joined a new project in the beginning of this year, and I inherited a test case repository of 5,000 test cases.
Wow.
So yeah, we do have those. On the level of organization, well, I didn't look at it now. I did a talk somewhere in a conference where I looked at the numbers. But we have, like, there's so much inventory in so-called test case documentation that just for this single project, I counted that if it takes me about 10 seconds to read each of those test cases, it would take me 11 full working days to read them through once. And I haven't yet done any actual taking time to think while reading them. And probably if I spend 11 days reading, it's not like I remember much of what I read. We've tried all kinds of, like, they're split into different projects. So the project means some kind of a piece of the software, and you can think of kind of like, having keywords and figuring out stuff there. But what is as reality is that you can spend all your life searching there, or you can just focus on creating something more lightweight that helps you follow the changes. So for me, the test cases, they're still ahead of me in the next 6 months. I was thinking of deleting all of them. That's probably what we'll do. Because we had a new project. Well, we had a team in India. Now we have a team in Turkey. The Turkish team created new test cases. Didn't use the previous team's test cases because they didn't like the way they were written. And so different people, different teams coming at different times with different experiences will probably need different documentation. And I would like to think in terms of it's probably a bigger hindrance for us if they have to spend 11 days reading than if they get to spend 11 days figuring out stuff from prompts that are a little unclear, but put them on the right path of discovering what the application does. So I have really lightened up the test case repository so that I only keep title level test cases, usually of features, of use cases, scenarios, flows, kind of like whatever helps me kind of pass the knowledge of what have we created in the past, not how it works, but what is there to discover. So I've tried to think more about who's reading the documentation rather than assuming it needs to give you all the answers. No one gets through those hundreds and thousands of pages that our people in the past have written. That's it requires someone who has actually spent all the time creating those. So it's that's not how information is passed on. Documentation doesn't work.
Well, there is a popular, argument or a rebuttal that's given every time you talk about the fact that you don't really need test cases. People will come and say, you know what, it helps, new joiners to learn
Yeah, it
test
helps new
cases.
joiners to learn to do a bad job. That's what I've
Okay.
experienced time and time again. It gives them a false sense of security where they don't have to take the responsibility of the results. And rather, what I do with the new joiners is comfort them in their feeling of being insufficient, of not having all the answers. I've had a 15-year-old boy join one of my teams in the past. His dad was working in the company, and his dad was insisting that he needs to have detailed test cases. And we, after a bit of a conversation, like strong-handed conversation, we did agree that instead of doing it the dad's way, we did it my way. And in 6 months, he learned to be a really, really good tester. If I would have allowed him to keep executing scripts, he would not have gotten where he got in those 2 years that we spent together.
So, are you trying to say that written test cases may hinder in some way the freedom the mind should have when you're working as a tester?
Somebody else's written test cases that you're trying to obey will hinder you. If you write things that are helpful to you, that help you remember things in 6 months, that help you explain it to whoever comes after you, but don't assume that it's a self-standing documentation that they can just figure out all by themselves. That's probably good. So ownership, agency, basically the feeling
Yeah.
that you have responsibility over the work and you do it the way that helps you and your team around you. It's a really important thing. And a lot of times we still think that we take away the agency and we believe in the magically smart people of the past who created the test cases. And then we just miss the bugs.
Yeah. Here is an interesting question. How do you approach your test automation? Like for the UI separate tool, for API different one, and another one for databases.
Yeah.
What's your
So
approach?
it depends on the team. In my current team, we are doing development in Python. So we have a Python plus Playwright for the GUI level stuff that we do. We have Python plus request library for anything API related. And we have a Python plus controlling databases for anything in the databases. We can mock pieces, whole components if we want to do very low code, or on the code level testing. So we can kind of we have long flows. We can inject stuff in the middle and then just test the end of the flow. So it is really a design and programming task on how we approach it. So it's not so much about the tool, but it's a lot more about what are we testing and how do we best test that.
So that makes me think a little bit. So, in case you are using different combinations of Python plus, Playwright for the UI and then something else for the API, how do you handle integration tests where it is across different levels? How do you handle that?
So again, you can also do some of the tests where you just use anything that is publicly available as an API, and you can orchestrate systems. You would probably have a folder of tests that intertwine with the internals of the system and need to have a different kind of setup. And then you would have some tests that don't intertwine with the internals and only use the public APIs and orchestrate stuff around that. But what I find is that we actually need a lot less on the end-to-end level than we often think in terms of we are at our, like exploratory testing wise, we are at our most creative when we think end-to-end. But when we then turn that end-to-end into something we implement as a test, the manual test, when we do that, we can actually probably turn it into many smaller scale technical tests.
Yes.
And it does the same thing. So it's kind of like decomposing the same thing differently. So one of the things I find that has been a bit of a struggle, and it's still kind of like something where there's a lot to learn on, is how this decomposure happens. Because a lot of times it feels like, you want to just spend your time on the high level and only focus on those things. And it requires that collaboration with the developers in order to agree on like, okay, so you will pick up my lovely end-to-end scenario and you do all of this in your lower level test. Like what's left for me? Like, what do I get to do then? Like, we actually don't need automation and all of that. But yes, you can have, and we do have some that actually orchestrate the entire system with the exact same tools.
I think that should answer the question from Shubhodaya. Um, Here is an interesting one, and I get goosebumps when I see these kind of questions. Context-driven testers or people who has inclination towards it keep bashing the ISTQB certification. In a debate, you're on which side to speak for automation or sorry for certification or not? What points would you highlight?
If you look at ISTQB Foundation certificate, who wrote it? I'm one. So I thought I can do something good with that. I thought we could create kind of a base knowledge of the words we need to use in testing projects. And I really put some time and effort into helping that happen back in the days. I have to say I'm the anti group, regardless of that, or maybe because of it, because of the experience. It was a change management nightmare. So whenever we agreed after a long conversation that we would fix something that was inherently wrong, we would fix it, and 2 weeks later, somehow magically, there was a change to the opposite direction, because the financial needs of the hundreds of organizations who were teaching based on that syllabus didn't want to correct certain things that I would have felt strongly, and even the core group back then would have felt strongly that we should have corrected. So I kind of gave up on that. The positives that I see of it is that it's even if it's a bad way, but it is still a way of showing that you're committed to wanting to learn about the things that are going on in the testing field. The problem that I have a lot of times is when people come to interviews and they say they have the ISTQB certification, then it's kind of like the same as with Scrum. Like, I read a book on Scrum, I know exactly how Scrum works. I now know how testing works. And then they don't get actually the idea that the way that they've learned, the whole conversation we had on test cases here, you would fail miserably in my teams and my organizations as a tester if you tried doing that. But you
Yeah.
could do something really brilliant and learn to be one of the best testers in the world if you did the things in the frame that I'm expecting my colleagues to do things in my organization. So coming with this idea that, I have taken the course and it must be the way that the course is, it's not always the positive thing. But I have realized that those of us who are bashing it actively, we usually have status of getting in the door in some other way. And it is a really important way when you don't have that status to show some level of commitment and that you have at least figured out where many people are starting. So that's kind of my positive on that, why I think it's still, worthwhile. Yeah, strong feelings, all sides.
A lot of organizations, Maaret, use the ISTQB Foundation level certificate as a tick in the box for qualifying for interviews, especially in a country like India, where for one job there are like hundreds and thousands of applications. So if somebody has to pick up, then if something they want to see different, they would look for an ISTQB certificate, and if there is a tick in the box, they'll say, okay, at least some consideration given to that. However, what has happened over the years is there has been so much of prevalence of the ISTQB and the entire thought process. People have started thinking and lecturing around that, and that has become sort of the way of working in a lot of organizations. Like, for example, we had that question previously, where the normal tendency is to write test cases, execute them, and then finally, in the end, find 1 or 2 days or maybe a few hours to do a little bit of exploratory testing. It's like, okay, so you squeeze it in. So that kind of approach, because of ISTQB, because of what it has been, the way it has been taught, not just the way it has been written, but the way it has been taught in companies. And a lot of these organizations, they have their in-house training teams which propagate this, and that is where I'm also in the anti group because of this sort of approach that has been taken towards the ISTQB. Well, I am a ISTQB certified tester myself. I was in the the syllabus review committee for a few years back in India. So I've also gone through that and been on both sides, so to speak. But now I know what is happening and how it is happening and things like that. So
But again, like I talked about the whole idea of Selenium and the admiration that I have for it
mhm,
continuing year over year. It's not
mhm,
easy to start something and have it continue year over year because interests
right,
of individuals change. So I
right,
do actually, like again, have that high respect for the fact that they have managed to create a global organization that makes
yes,
enough money to keep it sustainable, to keep this kind of drumming going on, even if
yes,
it's not perfect, and maybe it's even somehow sometimes harmful, and it's making it difficult for me to find good testers. I have to retrain them. I would rather take someone who doesn't have, sometimes that background, because unlearning is more difficult than teaching a newbie the good ways of working.
absolutely.
uh, I'd still have to say I respect the fact that they have managed to run the organization that keeps it alive, because it takes a lot of work. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. Well, Shubhode is asking a question. Shubhode, your question has been answered previously. So you will just have to rewind a little bit and watch it again on the skills that you need for a fresher to start or a newbie to start testing. Marit just answered that question previously. Here is another question that comes from Tara Shankar. Please let us know some resources to play around in enhancing testing skill. So how can somebody do that? How can somebody get better at testing?
Well, one thing you can do, like this is a little bit weird self-promotional thing, but there's a website called exploratorytestingacademy.com, where I created a foundation course. There's one course where there's one single small application, and it's kind of guiding you and forcing you into looking at that application under different constraints and seeing what kind of like how your results are changing. And it also provides then the kind of the answer key to all of the bugs that you might be missing. So in that particular application, and the application, it's just one of those many applications that Alan Richardson has available. He might not have the answer keys and kind of like how you use every single one of his things, but he has so many hands-on learning exercises. He has this
Yes.
brilliant API testing course, for example, where it's kind of like you have these secrets, like you get these points when you are able to call the API or test the API in the right way. So when you're trying to kind of figure out what's a response and what's a header and how do you kind of insert certain kind of things in an API call, it's actually a really fun way of learning that with a pair or in an ensemble. So Alan Richards has tons of these hands-on examples. And well, don't take anyone else's production sites and start testing them. Production and well, testing in somebody else's production, I think it's illegal, especially if you go towards a security-related problem. And if you manage to cause load, which is actually bothering real users, it just shows that you don't really understand that testing isn't supposed to be harming the people that we're sort of, set out to protect, which is stakeholders, including the users. So any of these exercises, James Lindsay has all of his
Yes.
testing machines. They are really good ones as well. And well, I like open source software, so take Drupal and install it and select some features to test. Take Selenium and install it and try creating automation cases. You might actually find problems of how it doesn't work when you are exploring with it. Anything that you can find. That could be a good one, but usually you want that answer key.
That is a great suggestion. That is a great list of suggestions. In fact, Alan, the evil tester, as he likes to be known as, has done quite a lot of good work, and has got a lot of examples and exercises that he provides. So it's worthwhile trying, and it's definitely worthwhile reading some of his work. If you are, there was a recent question that was asked, and I take this opportunity of answering that as well. So somebody asked me as a tester, what is the best resource to learn Java? How can I do it? And again, the answer is go and read Alan's book, Java for Testers. That's that's a very nicely written book, and it's a wonderful thing. So thank you, Maaret, again for highlighting those. I will put all those links in the description, and about the Exploratory Testing Academy as well. I'll put it in the link in the description box here after our session. Okay, so we've been speaking for quite some time. Unless the audience has any further questions, I would like to close this session. Maaret, it was an absolute pleasure hosting you. It was such a learning experience, and like I said before the interview, it was a real fanboy moment for me, because I have been wanting to do this for a lot of a long time, to have a conversation with you, to host you. And like I said, I've been following your work. I've read a lot of your blogs, not all of them perhaps, but a lot of them. Watched a lot of your session recordings wherever the videos are available. And it has been such an you know wonderful learning experience talking to you today and learning so much from you. Thank you, Maren.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun talking here. Yeah.
Thank you so much to the audience as well. You've had some wonderful questions. We will see you again on another episode of the What Lies Beneath AMA. Some interesting guests coming up in the next episode. So, keep your, what do you say? Be ready with your questions. Be ready with, your tea, coffee, popcorn, or whatever you need. So plan for that, and we'll be back with another session. Thank you so much, everyone.